Into the rabbit hole for Webinar Wednesday 232. Sometimes when I prepare one of these Webinar Wednesdays, I have this grand vision of a very simple and really useful webinar that we're going to do this week. I thought we'd talk about the Eisenhower Matrix, using it for making better decisions because it's a tool that I've grown to appreciate and can be used in so many different ways. And as I always do, I do extra research as I'm preparing for these. And I start these webinars maybe a month ahead of time is when I really start gathering all of the resources. And very quickly, I slipped into a rabbit hole when I was starting to prepare for this week's webinar. And I recognized that we should probably take a step back, or at least I think it's useful for us to take a step back and to really spend some time and understand if we're going to make better decisions, we have to look where we came from. We have to understand our decision-making habits, which most of us don't even know we have. At least maybe I'm speaking for you, but I never really realized I had decision-making habits. I knew I made the same choices over and over again, the same mistakes over and over again, but I never really considered it. I didn't spend a lot of time considering it. I don't know if you've spent a lot of time considering how you come to determinations, how you make decisions. Now, this can be profound. This can be life choices, where you're going to live, who you're going to marry, what you're going to do for a career, or it can be little things. It can be like, what's my daily routine going to be? What's the most important priority for work? Which social network should we be concentrating our effort on? Should I write a blog post or should I do a podcast? It can be as mundane as those things. Not that they're totally mundane, or it can be grand scale. So as I recognized that I might have bitten off more than I can chew, I started to look into how we make decisions, and more specifically, why we don't always make good decisions. So that's what we're going to start looking at. We will get to the Eisenhower Matrix, which is still a great tool, but I'm going to drag you right down into the rabbit hole with me. So what are the things that hold us back from making good decisions? I came up with a few classic issues that are fairly universal for us in how we make decisions. And a lot of them are based on our biases. They are our projection bias, our optimism bias, something called bike shedding, which is a strange term, which I will get into in a moment, and a restraint bias. And these are our predisposition in the decision-making process. And so much of it happen. Obviously, decision-making process, the reason that so many decisions fail or aren't optimal, that we don't choose the right direction, is our expectations going into it, is setting reasonable expectations going into it. And this seems to be endemic. This is something that it's a thread that weaves its way through our entire decision-making process. So we're going to start with something that's called the projection bias. And the projection bias is that it is understanding that our preferences, our goals that we're actually making a decision based on, we're assuming that when we accomplish that goal, that our priorities are going to be the same at that moment in time as they are as we're making this decision. What do you mean, Steve? I guess the classic example of this is don't shop while you're hungry. So you make all of these decisions on purchases and you bring all of this home because you're shopping. We all have done it. We're hungry. So we say, I'm going to buy a roasted chicken because even though it's 2 p.m. and you don't need a roasted chicken now, a snack would carry you through. But you buy all of this extra stuff when you're hungry, and a gallon of ice cream and a bunch of potato chips and a whole bunch of stuff that's going to sate your immediate craving, your immediate need. The decision you're making is what you're getting right now. And then when you get home, when you get to the point that you're actually using the payoff for all these decisions, you're home, you're making your dinner based on all these groceries that you purchased, you realize that you bought a bunch of things that you don't need, and you bought them just because your priorities at the moment that you made the decision were different than your priorities when the decision comes home to roost. So that is, I think that's profound. And it's something I've heard the term, I've heard the kind of the advice, don't shop while you're hungry, obviously, but I hadn't really taken it and considered how my decisions, when I am making decisions on the next project we're going to do, the next webinar Wednesday, etc., how when we make our decisions in our productivity sense, how our priorities when the decision that we make comes to fruition might be different than our priorities now. So this becomes really relevant when you're planning things like what are you going to spend your time and energy on, as far as when you're looking at your task list and you're saying, what are my priorities? And this will all be reflected ultimately in making better decisions in the Eisenhower Matrix. Understanding your projection bias, understanding that when you start on a project, when you do a task, that the completion of that task, your priorities may be different than they were when you started. It's something that I'm going to think of. I don't know necessarily how this manifests. Now, when I say that we're heading into a rabbit hole, recognize that each of these biases contribute to the other biases and contribute to the net effect of us making good or not as optimal decisions. And so one of the things that happens often with projection bias is we end up with, as you'll discover from some of our other biases, when we end up too optimistic, thinking that we're going to get more accomplished or it's going to get done in a sooner time, the recognition of when that decision, again, comes to fruition, that we might not have done as much on what we've started on. Consequently, it won't meet the needs that we think it'll meet. It's not just that our needs might be different, it's that our ability to deliver to that point is also something which we have to look at with realistic expectations. So the first bias that we should be considering as we make better decisions is understanding our projection bias and trying to cast our mind forward to what it will look like when we actually accomplish whatever goal or whatever project we are planning on. That's number one. Second is called the optimism bias. And this is where we think we're going to be more efficient than the reality. This one will land very close to home for many of us. When we make decisions, especially when we're looking at our productivity, on our personal schedule for the day, what we're going to work on, we're typically making decisions when we have a tremendous amount of energy, or when we have the maximum amount of energy in the day. When you're planning out your day, if you don't plan it out the night before, which is something that we often recommend you do, but if you're, say, getting up in the morning now, what am I going to work on today? And that's a project that I'm going to start on. And so you start on it with full of vim and vigor, and not really in considering that you're going to get this done, but not really looking at the reality of how much energy you have, how much time you have, what's going to interrupt you during the day. We tend to be overly optimistic about what we're going to accomplish. And so there is multiple levels of issues with this. Are you wanting to be a part of this, Gilly? There's multiple levels of issues that we have with our optimism bias. And one of them is that obviously we don't get as much done as we think we should get done or we want to get done. But then we also start this whole business of us then starting to judge ourselves and disappoint ourselves. And we start being critical of ourselves because we have fallen short of our objectives. I think this is a big deal. I think it's a big deal. And I think often we lose motivation because we continuously disappoint ourselves in what we do. And that comes from not us not being good workers, not us not doing the effort, not us. I think it comes from a rather sinister place of it's our own expectations that have set this in place, not necessarily the reality. And so if we had set reasonable expectations, we wouldn't have disappointed ourselves and we wouldn't be judging ourselves as hardly. So consequently, we'll have more energy. There's a feedback loop in the optimism bias, which I think is a little bit insidious. Case in point with the optimism bias is having a puppy that suddenly requires attention while you're in the middle of working on a project that you think you should be getting done. All of a sudden, you don't get as much time as you think you might. It's not quite as bad because I do plan for Gilly interrupting on a regular basis. The next issue that we have isn't as much an issue, I think, it is an issue with individuals, but it also becomes a big issue when you're making decisions as a group. And it's something called bike shedding, which is a passing curious phrase, is it not? So what bike shedding effectively is, the result of bike shedding is we spend more time on menial tasks than we do on the tasks that actually move the ball downfield. The issue, so it's easier to do busy work than deep work that requires effort, concentration, commitment. It's a lot easier for us to clean out our junk email than it is to respond to a single email that you're having a difficult conversation with a customer. So bike shedding is our tendency to spend more time on less productive tasks. Now you're saying, Steve, where the heck does this term bike shedding come from? It comes from whoever coined the term was talking about group decision making. And they were talking about what would be accomplished in a meeting where you have three objectives. The first is you have to plan a nuclear plant. You have to plan, say, where a nuclear plant is going to go or what you're going to do with a nuclear plant. Big decision, huge, tough, difficult for people to come to terms with. The second meeting agenda, and that was we're going to put a bike shed on the nuclear plant site. So how large a bike shed do we need, etc. And the third is what sort of coffee are we going to have for the coffee room? And as from any meeting that you've been in, that any group will spend far more time discussing the bike shed, which is far less important than something that's much more difficult to deliver feedback on, which is the big picture of the nuclear plant, and then even more time on the coffee, which is just mundane. So so for us, it's that tendency to feel like we're accomplishing something by staying busy, but we're not really in productive space. And the Eisenhower Matrix really will help us with this particular process because it helps us identify the high value activities which we should be spending our time on, and it holds us accountable. Using a tool like the Eisenhower Matrix to help with bike shedding is certainly one aspect, but another thing you can do is you can create urgency by putting timelines on your expectations for your projects or for your decisions, and by putting timelines on the completion of different tasks. You can create urgency as long as you adhere to that. That's one way of helping you overcome it, because regardless of what we're going to do with a bike shed, you still got to make that big decision on the plant, and if you set a timeline for it, hopefully that will facilitate you making that decision and avoiding bike shedding to being too serious. Strange term. Our fourth issue holding us back is the restraint bias. I feel like I have to apologize to everybody today because I feel like I'm beating us up. I feel like I'm beating me up because I'm suddenly looking at all of these, I won't call them mistakes, but all of these habits that I've fallen into in my life, which I believe if I had addressed earlier would have facilitated me making better decisions at different points in my life. Now, who knows what the result of that would have been, but I'm feeling a little bit inadequate right now. I don't know if you are as well. And nothing bubbles to the surface, our inadequacies more than our restraint bias. And this is our inflated opinion of our own discipline, of us overestimating our ability to stay on task, to stay focused, and not to fall into one of the traps like bike shedding, or not to get distracted, or not to get off target. So the restraint bias is the fact that, again, when we are planning, and remember, this isn't about accomplishing goals. This is about making the decision of what you're going to do. We have to recognize that. This isn't about your ability to complete the goal. This is about your ability to make a better decision on what the goal should be. So our restraint bias affects us because we don't judge ourselves harshly enough to recognize exactly when we will fall off the bandwagon, how long we will be able to stay focused. If we look at the projection bias, we've got lots of energy when we start, and when there's no distractions, we don't think we're going to get distracted. But as the going gets tough, as we start slogging, we suddenly fall into bike shedding, going to a simpler task, or we get distracted and we move off and we do something else and we allow distraction to come in. So there's a lot of we've each got different habits that we do in our productivity makeup that pull us off tasks. And so that's a different conversation. Getting more discipline isn't what you're going to do in making better decisions. Understanding the realities of what you will accomplish and where you will disappoint yourself. Oh, this is terrible. Where you may disappoint yourself. That's what restraint bias is. So planning and making better decisions, understanding the limitations of you as a worker. And we look at all of these different biases that we've talked about: optimism, projection, restraint. These are all comes down to our focus and our ability to actually accomplish what it is that we are setting out to do, other than projection, which is understanding that we might have different priorities at that particular point. But recognize that this is all really taken a realistic understanding of our capacity to accomplish what it is that we're making a decision on, both as an individual and as groups within a team environment. So that if we consider that without getting too depressed and without being too hard on ourselves, if we start as we make our decisions, taking into account a little bit more of our different biases, projection bias, bike shedding, optimism, or the restraint bias, and we start just acknowledging it ourselves and start internalizing it and coming to terms with it a little more, as we start to lay out our Eisenhower Matrix, as we look at and as we now add structure to decision making, which is really what the Eisenhower Matrix does, I think this will help us move towards making better decisions. This isn't a binary situation. You don't make poor decisions and then make good decisions. It's we're graded on the bell curve here as far as our decisions goes, and some of them are better than others. Some of them end up being better over time, whereas they might have been not as good a decision in the short term. We're talking about very kind of nebulous outcomes as we're making decisions, but I think each of us is sophisticated enough that we can recognize the variations in outcomes as far as our decision making, but we will all, I think, want to choose things which are more productive, more beneficial, better as far as our decisions goes. So now that we started to understand the issues that we have, let's look at the tool that I originally wanted to talk to you about, which is the Eisenhower Matrix. The Eisenhower Matrix, named, of course, after Dwight D. Eisenhower, the I don't know what number president of the United States, and he used this technique to help him get clarity of mind as he made decisions, and it became I think it's a terrific tool, and it's so flexible for us to work with. So here effectively is what the Eisenhower Matrix is, and you will find, we'll share with you in the resources some different people's approach to using the Eisenhower Matrix, but effectively it works thusly. There are two axes to the Eisenhower Matrix. We have effort and impact. Now this is interchangeable. We can plug other criteria in on these axes for different types of decision making that we have to do. But effectively the Eisenhower Matrix works this way all of the time. You have different quadrants which determine whether or not tasks or outcomes or projects are high impact and low effort, high impact and high effort, low impact and low effort, and low impact and high effort. You can see it listed out here. And this can be using to determine what tasks you should be doing from a productivity point of view. You can also change the values and put whole different things. If you're looking for places to live, you can say you can have cost on one and resources or the amenities on another matrix, and then you can put the different houses you're looking at on the matrix, and it'll help you classify which houses. So typically speaking though, the highest value, the highest bang for your buck is in the upper left-hand quadrant, because it's the things that are the lowest effort, cost the least, but are best. They have the highest impact. The second best quadrant would be usually the high impact, high effort. So these are things you work on hard or spend a lot of money on, but they're really good. They do a lot of good. Then you've got things that are low impact but low effort. That's busy work. And that's really where bike shedding comes in. It's making the easy decisions that are easy to do. And that's a place that we tend to drop to and gravitate towards often. And a lot of our work ends up in this quadrant, and it's busy work. I can't really come up with a better term for it. And that's definitely the bike shedding quadrant. And then with the other quadrant, this is the no-go. This is the no-fly zone. It's something that you have to work hard on, and it has very low impact. This is ideal for you to look at outsourcing or not doing at all. This sort of tasks and projects that end up in this quadrant. And because we've got these axes, things that are closer to the center are going to be, for example, if you move this task here, I'll be sharing this graphic with you. It's just a Canva worksheet. I'm going to take that text out. But if you put an item here, it is fairly high effort and moderately useful and moderately impactful. But if you go here, if you put something here, you've got something which is moderately difficult, or it takes a moderate amount of effort to do, but it's really impactful. It makes a big difference. But if you can get your decisions and you can get your projects, if you've got something that's here, sitting over here, which should be easy to accomplish, low effort, high impact. If you have a house that's really reasonably priced, but has phenomenal amenities here, this is what you should be considering. This quadrant, things that are up in the upper left-hand side, that's the stuff that you should be doing first. So if you put down anything, what social network should I be working with? What social network should I be spending my energy on? If this is YouTube here and you've got, let me just duplicate that, and you've got a Twitter down here, which is, it's low effort, but it doesn't really have the same kind of impact. That helps you visually make a decision, stripping out all of the other criteria and say, okay, obviously this has more value. This is something that I should be spending more time on than this. Now, as we look at this and we start to recognize our biases, it can help us position tasks on the Eisenhower Matrix, or position ideas and projects on the Eisenhower Matrix more accurately. Let's consider the projection bias, how our goals or how our priorities once something is completed might be different than we think they are right now. In that particular case, you might be inclined, as you're looking at a task or you're looking at a project, to give it high impact. But if you really consider your projection bias and you say, wait a minute, in 2 weeks, what's the lay of the land going to be look like? We're going to accomplish these other things, or hopefully we've accomplished these other things. Is this really the most important thing at that point? So it'll help you determine where it sits on the vertical axis here will be at high impact or lesser impact based on your projection bias. So the combination of understanding how we make decisions and how we color and how we prejudice our decisions as we're making them. And when we add that to the Eisenhower Matrix, which is a productivity tool that's going to help us choose and make the best decisions, that combination, I think, puts us in good stead to possibly make better decisions as we go along. Now, in the resources I'll share with you, I made this a template in Canva, so you can actually use this. This isn't a nice interactive tool. It's a visual tool that you can use, but you can change the access here to meet what you need. You can change the colors, and you can start to lay it out yourself. And maybe creating a graphic that you can then share with others when you're in a meeting as you take a look at the Eisenhower Matrix, or just use it personally yourself. It will help you clarify your decisions. And with so much of this, I think that making good decisions is often a multi-day process. Is you put down we didn't talk about recency bias. That's another one. Based on what's happening in your life at this moment, as you put down your decisions, if you look at it the next day, you can take that, even another bias, recency bias, out of the equation, so that the farther away you get from when you actually set the criteria for what you should be doing or set the Eisenhower Matrix up. If you look at it a week after you initially set it up, the position of the different items in it, of the tasks, could change dramatically, because you're much closer to the payoff for the optimism bias, but you've also taken a bias that I didn't even put in the list, which is recency bias, out of it. So when I say it's a multi-day process, create your Eisenhower Matrix, put it to bed, go away from it, come back to it, and see if at second glance you agree with the criteria that you put in place. And all of this combined, better understanding and a tool that helps us create structure to our decisions, that should help us make better decisions.